On this day in history, October 1st, 331 BC, Alexander the Great defeats Darius III of Persia in the Battle of Gaugamela. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the lead-up to the battle. Battle of Gaugamela, or Arbela, October 1st, 331 BC. After his defeat at Issus, Darius assembled a vast horde of men at Babylon. Thence, marching northwards, he crossed to the left bank of the Tigris and established his magazines and harems at Arbela. From Arbela, he moved forward to Gaugamela, some 32 miles westward. Having conquered Egypt, Alexander marched northwards through Palestine, crossed the Tigris at Bezebdi, north of modern Mosul, and, learning of the Persian king's whereabouts, he at once moved forward with a picked force of cavalry. Having located the enemy, he rested his army for 4 days and fortified his camp. Whilst this was taking place, Darius deployed his army on the plains of Gaugamela, which he converted into a huge parade ground by leveling it. On the 4th night, Alexander advanced, but when 3.5 miles distant from him, he called a halt and assembled his generals. Parmenio suggested that they should encamp where they were, and reconnoiter the ground and the enemy. To this Alexander agreed, and whilst the camp was being fortified, he took the light infantry and the companion cavalry and went all round, reconnoitering the whole country where he was about to fight the battle. On his return, he called together a conference at which he discussed what he had seen, and urged upon his generals the importance of the immediate execution of orders. Whilst the soldiers were resting, Parmenio called to Alexander's tent and suggested a night attack. This proposal Alexander refused to consider. His reason, more probable than the story of his disdaining such craft, being that in the approaching battle he had planned to deliver a decisive blow, and he knew well the difficulties coincident with night operations. Having rejected this advice, Alexander drew up the army. The phalanx was marshaled in the center, the right wing consisting of its 3 right divisions, the Hypapsis, the Agrippina, and the companion cavalry, the left wing of the remaining 3 divisions of the phalanx, the Grecian cavalry, and the Thessalonian cavalry. Thus far, the order of battle was normal. The problem which faced Alexander was very similar to that which confronted Cyrus in Xenophon's account of the Battle of Thymbra. Alexander applied tactics made use of at Thymbra. Behind his front, he drew up a reserve force consisting of 2 flying columns. These he posted one behind each wing at an angle to the front, so that they might take the enemy in flank, should an attempt be made to turn the wings, or, if this did not take place, then they were to wheel inwards and reinforce the main army. In front of the companion cavalry, he posted half of the Agrianians, archers and javelin men, to oppose the charge of the Persian chariots. The baggage guard consisted of Thracian infantry. In all, Alexander's army consisted of 7,000 cavalry and 40,000 foot. The Persians were, in all probability, about 5 times as strong. This order of battle should be kept clearly in mind, for, as it will be seen, it was through Alexander's ability to develop his tactics from it that he won the battle. On this day in history, October 2nd, 829, Theophilus succeeds his father Michael II as Byzantine Emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Theophilus, East Roman Emperor from 829 to 842, the second of the Phrygian dynasty, a pronounced iconoclast. In 832, he issued an edict strongly forbidding the worship of images. His whole reign was occupied in war against the caliphs of Baghdad. This war was caused by Theophilus, who afforded an asylum to a number of Persian refugees. The Roman arms were at first successful. In 837, Samosata and Zebatra, Sozopetra, the birthplace of Motasim, were taken and destroyed. Eager for revenge, Motasim assembled a vast army, 1 division of which defeated Theophilus, who commanded in person at Dazimon, while the other advanced against Amorium, the cradle of the Phrygian dynasty. After a brave resistance, the city fell into Motasim's hands through treachery. 30,000 of the inhabitants were slain, and the city razed to the ground. Theophilus never recovered from this blow, and he died at the beginning of 842. On this day in history, October 3rd, 52 BC, as part of the Gallic Wars, Vercingetorix, leader of the Gauls, surrenders to the Romans under Julius Caesar, ending the siege and Battle of Alesia. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the siege. siege of Alesia was the climax of the great revolt which endangered Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul. He was temporarily back in Italy after his expeditions across the Rhine and the Channel when word came of the general rising, end of 53 BC, of most of the Gallic tribes under Vercingetorix, a chieftain of the Averni, modern Auvergne. Fortunately for Caesar, it came before he was entangled in the civil war, and by rapid countermeasures involving arduous midwinter marches, he partially restored the situation. But guerrilla warfare on a far-reaching scale undermined his efforts. He was forced to abandon his siege of Gergovia, modern Clermont-Ferrand, Vercingetorix's own town, and through the Audi, joining in the revolt, was cut off from his base in the south. In this critical situation, Caesar first moved to effect a junction with Labienus's detachment, which had, with difficulty, returned from an abortive attempt on Lutetia, modern Paris, and then sought a line of retreat back to his base, taking an easterly route. But Vercingetorix, emboldened by success to discard pure harassing strategy, moved to intercept him near the modern-day Langres, and surprised him on the march. The Romans succeeded in repulsing the attack, and Vercingetorix retreated to a fortified camp at Alesia, probably Mont Oxus, near modern Dijon. Thus assured of the communications being free, Caesar decided to lay siege to Alesia, which now held the soul as well as a large part of the body of the revolt. He completely invested the position, surrounding it with lines of contravallation, 10 miles in perimeter, and fortified with all the science of Roman field engineering. And outside these, he built lines of circumvallation to protect himself from any relieving forces. These soon gathered in great force, but inadequate organization, and their onsets were repulsed until, finding that Vercingetorix's sortie was equally ineffectual, they retired. The third and last attempt, made at the weakest spot, a hill which could not be included in the lines of circumvallation, was barely withstood, but with its failure, Vercingetorix was forced, from a lack of supplies, to surrender. Thereafter, although isolated outbreaks occurred, the Roman grip upon Gaul was not again seriously threatened. On this day in history, October 4th, 1209, Otto IV is crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope Innocent III. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the Emperor. Otto IV, circa 1182 to 1218. Roman Emperor, second son of Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, and Matilda, daughter of Henry II, King of England, was most probably born at Argentan in central France. His father died when he was still young, and he was educated at the court of his uncle Richard I, King of England, under whose leadership he gained valuable experience in war, being appointed Duke of Aquitaine, Count of Poitou, and Earl of Yorkshire. When the Emperor Henry VI died in September 1197, some of the princes under the leadership of Adolf, Archbishop of Cologne, were anxious to find a rival to Philip, Duke of Swabia, who had been elected German king. After some delay, their choice fell upon Otto, who was chosen king at Cologne on June 9, 1198. Hostilities broke out at once, and Otto, after a series of defeats, was driven to Brunswick. Preparations were made to drive him from there, and when he was saved by the murder of Philip in June 1208. Many of the supporters of Philip now made overtures to Otto, and an attempt to set up Henry I, Duke of Brabant, having failed, Otto submitted to a fresh election and was chosen German king at Frankfurt on November 11, 1208, in the presence of a large gathering of princes. A general reconciliation followed, which was assisted by the betrothal of Otto to Philip's eldest daughter, Beatrix. But as she was only 10 years old, the marriage was deferred until July 22, 1212. The Pope, who had previously recognized the victorious Philip, hastened to return to the side of Otto. Large concessions were made to the church. In August 1209, the king set out for Italy. Meeting with no opposition, he was received at Viterbo by Innocent, but refused the papal demand that he should concede to the church all the territories which, previous to 1197, had been in dispute between the empire and the papacy, consenting, however, not to claim supremacy over Sicily. He was crowned emperor at Rome on October 4th, 1209, a ceremony which was followed by the fighting between the Romans and the German soldiers. The Pope then requested the emperor to leave Roman territory, but he remained near Rome for some days, demanding satisfaction for the losses suffered by his troops. The breach with Innocent soon widened, and in violation of the treaty made with the Pope, Otto attempted to recover for the empire all the property which Innocent had annexed to the church, and rewarded his supporters with large estates in the disputed territories. Having occupied Tuscany, he marched into Apulia, part of the kingdom of Frederick of Hohenstaufen, afterwards the Emperor Frederick II, and on November 18, 1210, was excommunicated by the Pope. Regardless of the sentence, Otto completed the conquest of southern Italy, but the efforts of Innocent had succeeded in arousing considerable opposition in Germany, where the rebels were also supported by Philip Augustus, King of France. A number of princes assembled at Nuremberg declared Otto deposed, and invited Frederick to fill the vacant throne. Returning to Germany in March 1212, Otto made some headway against his enemies until the arrival of Frederick towards the close of the year. The death of his wife in August 1212 had weakened his hold on the southern duchies, and he was soon confined to the district of the Lower Rhine, although supported by money from his uncle King John of England. The final blow to his fortunes came when he was decisively defeated by the French at Douvrin in July 1214. He escaped with some difficulty from the fight and took refuge in Cologne. His former supporters hastened to recognize Frederick, and in 1216 he left Cologne for Brunswick, which he had received in 1202 by arrangement with his elder brother Henry. The conquest of Hamburg by the Danes and the death of John of England were further blows to his cause. On May 19, 1218, he died at the Harzburg after being loosed from the band by a Caesarean monk, and was buried in the church of St. Blasius at Brunswick. He left no children. On this day in history, October 5th, 610, Heraclius arrives at Constantinople, kills Byzantine Emperor Phocas, and becomes emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Heraclius, circa 575 to 642, East Roman Emperor, was born at Cappadocia. His father held high military command under the Emperor Maurice, and as governor of Africa maintained his independence against the usurper Phocas. When invited to head a rebellion against the latter, he sent his son with a fleet which reached Constantinople unopposed and precipitated the dethronement of Phocas. Proclaimed emperor, 610, Heraclius set himself to reorganize the utterly disordered administration. At first, he found himself helpless before the Persian armies of Khosrow II, which conquered Syria and Egypt, and since 616 had encamped outside Constantinople. In 618, he even proposed to abandon his capital and seek a refuge in Carthage, but at the entreaty of the Patriarch he took courage. By securing a loan from the church and suspending the corn distribution at Constantinople, he raised sufficient funds for war, and after making a treaty with the Avars, who had nearly surprised the capital during an incursion in 619, he was at last able to take the field against Persia. During his first expedition, 622, he failed to secure a footing in Armenia, whence he had hoped to take the Persians in flank, but by his unwearied energy he restored the discipline and efficiency of the army. In his second campaign, 624-26, he penetrated into Armenia and Albania, and beat the enemy in the open field. After a short stay at Constantinople, which his son Constantine had successfully defended against renewed incursions by the Avars, Heraclius resumed his attacks upon the Persians, 627. Though deserted by the Khazars, with whom he had made an alliance upon entering into Pontus, he gained a decisive advantage by a brilliant march across the Armenian highlands into the Tigris plains, and a hard-fought victory over Khosrow's general Shah-Baraz, in which Heraclius distinguished himself by his personal bravery. A subsequent revolution at the Persian court led to the dethronement of Khosrow in favor of his son Kavad II. The new king promptly made peace with the emperor, whose troops were already advancing upon the Persian capital at Ctesiphon. 628. Having secured his eastern frontier, Heraclius returned to Constantinople with the True Cross, which in 629 he brought back in person to Jerusalem. On the northern frontier of the empire, he kept the Avars in check by inducing the Serbs to migrate from the Carpathians to the Balkan lands so as to divert the attention on the Avars. The triumphs which Heraclius had won did not bring him lasting popularity. In his civil administration, he followed out his own ideas without deferring to the nobles or the church, and the opposition which he encouraged from these quarters went far to paralyze his attempts at reform. Worn out by continuous fighting and weakened by dropsy, Heraclius failed to show sufficient energy against the new peril that menaced his eastern provinces. Towards the end of his reign, in 629, the Saracens made their first incursion into Syria. In 636, they won a notable victory on the Hieromax, and in the following years conquered all Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Heraclius made no attempt to retrieve the misfortunes of his generals, but evacuated his possessions in sullen despair. The remaining years of his life he devoted to theological speculation and ecclesiastical reforms. His religious enthusiasm led him to oppress his Jewish subjects. On the other hand, he sought to reconcile the Christian sects, and to this effect propounded in his Ekthesis a consolatory doctrine of monothelism. Heraclius died of dropsy in 642. He had been married twice. His second union, with his niece Myrtina, was frequently made a matter of reproach to him. In spite of his partial failures, Heraclius must be regarded as one of the greatest of Byzantine emperors, and his early campaigns were the means of saving the realm from almost certain destruction. On this day in history, October 6th, 105 BC, as part of the Cimbrian War, defeat at the Battle of Arusio of the Roman army of the Mid-Republic. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. From 202 BC, when the Battle of Zama gave the world to Rome, and the tide of Roman expansion rolled onwards without serious check or menace for nearly a century. Then, however, a thundercloud gathered beyond the Alps which sent a shiver of fear through Italy. It was the first, and after came a long interval, of the great migrations which lapped and ultimately submerged the bulwarks of Rome. The two principal tribes, or really nations, were the Cimbri and the Teutons, and after a pause of several years in Gaul, they moved afresh towards Italy. So seriously was the menace viewed that the consul Maximus was sent, 105 BC, with an army to reinforce the existing army of the proconsul Scipio. Scipio resented the loss of his independent authority, although he joined Maximus at Arusio, modern-day Orange, on the lower Rhone. While Maximus was prudently negotiating, Scipio attacked the Cimbri single-handed. Although having to fight with the river at his back, he was overwhelmed, and the consular army was drawn into disaster, comparable in the scale of Cannae. Happily for Rome, the Cimbri and Teutons inexplicably turned aside from Italy and followed the route to Spain. The disaster at Arusio and the urgent need to raise fresh forces gave the coup de grace to the traditional system of citizen armies, already decaying, and supplied the impetus which enabled Marius, elected consul 2 months later, to develop the highly trained long-service professional army. The new model was soon to be christened at Aquae Sextae. On this day in history, October 7th, 1571, the Battle of Lepanto is fought, and the Ottoman navy suffers its first defeat. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. The Battle of Lepanto was fought on October 7th, 1571, between the forces of the Christian League and Turkey. The League had been formed mainly by the efforts of Pope Pius V, to whom Venice had appealed against the constant depredations of the Turk, culminating in their seizure of Cyprus, and its naval forces were supplied mainly by Venice and Spain, the former having Barbarigo and Venerio as their principal admirals, the latter the Marquis of Santa Cruz. There was also a small squadron from the Papal States, commanded by Colonna, and a Genoese squadron under Andrea Doria. The total Christian force numbered over 300 ships, including 8 galleasses and some 208 galleys. The supreme command was given to Don John of Austria. The allies concentrated at Messina, the Turk making no attempt to intercept a Venetian squadron which had to join them from the eastern Mediterranean. Thence they proceeded to the Gulf of Lepanto, where the Turkish force from the Aegean awaited them. The Turks, 300 strong, including over 250 galleys, were drawn up just inside the Gulf, stretching nearly from shore to shore. The commander-in-chief, Ali Pasha, was in the center, and the right and left were commanded by Mohammed Sirocco and Ulugh Ali, respectively. The Allies had to deploy round the headland on the northern side of the Gulf, and then the galleasses, leading, descended in line abreast on the Turk. On the two flanks they were not immediately successful. Barbarigo, on the left, came under the full fire of the Turks as he deployed, while Ulugh Ali completely outmaneuvered the Christian right. Pretending to outflank his foe, he induced Andrea Doria to part company with his center and broke through the gap so created, the situation only being saved by the foresight of Santa Cruz with the reserve squadron. In the center, however, the Christians achieved great success. Ali Pasha's galley was captured and his squadron utterly beaten. Panic spread to other Turkish squadrons, and the greater part of their fleet was taken or destroyed, Olak Ali alone escaping with some of his ships. The battle was remarkable in two ways. First, as the last great battle in which both sides used oar-propellered vessels. Secondly, for its enormous casualties, reckoned at various figures. The Christians had some 8,000 men killed and double that number wounded, while the Turks had about 25,000 killed and an unknown number wounded. Further, some 15,000 Christians in the Turkish galleys were liberated from slavery. On this day in history, October 8th, 451, the first session of the Council of Chalcedon begins. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the council. Council of Chalcedon, the fourth ecumenical council of the Catholic Church, was held in 451, its occasion being the Eutychian heresy and the notorious Robber Synod, which called forth vigorous protests both in the East and West, and a loud demand for a new general council, a demand that was ignored by the Eutychian Theodosius II, but speedily granted by his successor Marcion. In response to the imperial summons, 500 to 600 bishops, all Eastern, except the Roman legates and 2 Africans, assembled in Chalcedon on October 8, 451. The Bishop of Rome claimed for his legates the right to preside, and insisted that any act they failed to receive their approval would be invalid. The first session was tumultuous. Party feeling ran high, and scurrilous epithets were bandied to and fro. The acts of the Robber Synod were examined. Fraud, violence, and coercion were charged against it. Its entire proceedings were annulled, and at the third session, its leader, Dioscorus, was deposed and degraded. The emperor requested a declaration of the true faith, but the sentiment of the council was opposed to a new symbol. It contested itself with reaffirming the Nicene and Constantinopolitan creeds and the Ephesine formula of 431, and accepting only, after examination, the Christological statement contained in the Epistole Dogmatica of Leo I to Flavianus. Thus the council rejected both Nestorianism and Eutychianism, and stood upon the doctrine that Christ had 2 natures, each perfect in itself and each distinct from the other, yet perfectly united in one person, who was at once both God and man. With this spirit, which was formally subscribed in the presence of the emperor, the development of the Christological doctrine was completed, but not in the manner to obviate further controversy. The remaining sessions were occupied with matters of discipline, episcopal jurisdiction, organization of diocese and parish, occupations of the clergy, and the like, and confirmed the third canon of the Second Ecumenical Council, which accorded to Constantinople equal privileges with Rome, and the second rank among patriarchates, and, in addition, granted to Constantinople patriarchal jurisdiction over Pontus, Asia, and Thrace. The Roman legates, who were absent, designedly, when this famous, the 28th, canon was adopted, protested against it, but in vain, the imperial commissioners deciding in favor of its regularity and validity. Leo I, although he recognized the council as ecumenical and confirmed its doctrinal decrees, rejected Canon 28 on the ground that it contravened the 6th canon of Nicaea and infringed the rights of Alexandria and Antioch. In what proportional zeal for the ancient canons and the rights of others, and jealous fear of encroachment upon his own jurisdiction, were mixed in the motives of Leo, it would be interesting to know. The canon was universally received in the East. The Emperor Marcion approved the doctrinal decrees of the council and enjoined silence in regard to theological questions. Eutyches and Dioscorus and their followers were deposed and banished. On this day in history, October 9th, 768, Carloman I and Charlemagne are crowned kings of the Franks. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Carloman. Carloman, born 751, died 771, king of the Franks, was the son of King Pepin the Short, and consequently a brother of Charlemagne. The brothers became joint kings of the Franks on Pippin's death, in 768. Trouble between them arising of the conduct of the war in Aquitaine was followed by Carloman's death at Samusi on December 4th, 771. He married Gerberga, daughter of Desiderius, king of the Lombards. On this day in history, October 10th, 19 AD, the Roman general Germanicus dies near Antioch. He was convinced that the mysterious illness that ended in his death was a result of poisoning by the Syrian governor Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, whom he had ordered to leave the province. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the general. Germanicus Caesar, born 15 BC, died 1980, a Roman general and provincial governor in the reign of Tiberius. The name Germanicus, the only one by which he is known in history, he inherited from his father, Nero Claudius Drusus, the famous general, brother of Tiberius and stepson of Augustus. His mother was the younger Antonia, daughter of Marcus Antonius and niece of Augustus, and he married Agrippina, the granddaughter of the same emperor. It was natural, therefore, that he should be regarded as a candidate for the purple. Augustus, it would seem, long hesitated whether he should name him as his successor, and as a compromise required his uncle Tiberius to adopt him, though Tiberius had a son of his own. Of his early years and education, little is known. Suetonius and Ovid allow him a reputation as an orator. At the age of 20, he served under Tiberius and received the triumphal insignia for crushing the revolt in Dalmatia and Pannonia. In 11 AD, he accompanied Tiberius in his campaign on the Rhine. In 12, he was made consul and increased his popularity by appearing as an advocate in the courts of justice and by the celebration of brilliant games. Soon afterwards, he was appointed by Augustus to the command of the 8 legions on the Rhine. The news of the emperor's death, 14 AD, found Germanicus at Lugdunum, Lyons, where he was superintending the census of Gaul. Close upon this came the report that a mutiny had broken out among his legions on the lower Rhine. Germanicus hurried back to the camp, which was now an open insurrection. The tumult was with difficulty quelled, partly by concessions, for which the authority of the emperor was forged, but chiefly owing to his personal popularity. Some of the soldiers suggested that he should claim the empire for himself, but he refused. In order to calm the excitement, Germanicus determined at once on an active campaign. Crossing the Rhine, he attacked and routed the Marsi and laid waste the valley of the Ems. In the following year, he marched against Arminius, the conqueror of Varus, and performed the last rites over his remains of the Roman soldiers that still lay there unburied, erecting a barrow to mark the spot. Arminius, however, favored by the marshy ground, was able to hold his own, and it required another campaign before he was finally defeated. A masterly combined movement by land and water enabled Germanicus to concentrate his forces against the main body of the Germans encamped on the Weser, and to crush them in 2 ostensibly contested battles. The success of Germanicus had already stirred the jealousy and fears of Tiberius, and he was reluctantly compelled to return to Rome. On May 26, 17, he celebrated a triumph. The enthusiasm with which he was welcomed, not only by the populace but by the emperor's own praetorians, was so great that the earliest pretext was seized to remove him from Rome. He was sent to the east with extraordinary powers to settle a disputed succession in Parthia and Armenia. At the same time, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, one of the most violent and ambitious of the old nobility, was sent as governor of Syria to watch his movements. Germanicus proceeded by easy stages to his province, halting on his way in Dalmatia, and visiting the battlefield of Actium, Athens, Ilium, and other places of historic interest. When he reached his destination, he found little difficulty in effecting the settlement of the disturbed provinces, notwithstanding Piso's violent and persistent opposition. At Artaxica, Zeno, the popular candidate for the throne, was crowned king of Armenia. To the provinces of Cappadocia and Comagene, Roman governors were assigned. Parthia was conciliated by the banishment of the dethroned king, Vonones. After wintering in Syria, Germanicus started for a tour in Egypt, but he was warned by Tiberius that he was thereby transgressing an unwritten law which forbade any Roman of rank to set foot in Egypt without express permission. On his return to Syria, he found that all his arrangements had been upset by Piso. At Epidaphne, near Antioch, he was attacked by a fatal illness, which he himself and his friends attributed to poison administered by Placinia, the the wife of Piso, at the instigation of Tiberius. His ashes were brought to Rome in the following year, 20, by his wife Agrippina, and deposited in the grave of Augustus. He had 9 children, 6 of whom, 3 sons and 3 daughters, survived him, amongst them the future Emperor Gaius and the notorious Agrippina, the mother of Nero. The news of his death cast a gloom over the whole empire. He possessed considerable literary abilities. His speeches and Greek comedies were highly spoken of by his contemporaries. On this day in history, October 11th, 1649, Cromwell's New Model Army sacks Wexford, killing over 2,000 Irish Confederate troops and 1,500 civilians. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the town. Wexford, a seaport and the county town of County Wexford, heir, population 1936, 12,247. Wexford was an early colony of the English, having been taken by Fitzstephen. It was the second town that Cromwell besieged in 1649. It was garrisoned for William III in 1690. In 1798, it was made the headquarters of the rebels who, however, surrendered it on the 21st of June. In 1318, the town received a charter from Emir de Valence, which was extended by Henry IV in 1411 and confirmed by Elizabeth in 1558. By James I, it was in 1608 made a free borough corporate. Wexford Harbour, formed by the estuary of the Slaney, is about 5 miles from north to south and about 4 miles from east to west. There are quays extending nearly 900 yards. A bar at its mouth prevents the entrance of vessels drawing more than 12 feet. An artificial harbour was therefore opened at Rosslare in 1906, and this is connected with Wexford by a railway, 8 3/4 miles, owned by the Great Southern Company, and is served by the passenger steamers of the Great Western Railway of England from Fishguard. Some remains exist of the old walls and flanking towers. The Protestant church, near the ruins of the ancient abbey of St. Sepulchre or Selsker, is said to occupy the spot where the treaty was signed between the Irish and the English invaders in 1169. At Carrick, 2 miles west, the Anglo-Normans erected their first castle. The principal exports are agricultural produce, livestock, and whiskey. Shipbuilding is carried on, and also tanning, malting, brewing, iron founding, distilling, and the manufacture of artificial manure, flour, agricultural implements, and rope and twine. Wexford is the headquarters of salmon and sea fishery districts. On this day in history, October 12th, 539 BC, the army of Cyrus the Great of Persia conquer Babylon, ending the Babylonian Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the Scythian influence of Babylon. When Ashurbanipal died, his empire was fast breaking up. Under his successor, Ashur-etil-ilani, the Scythians penetrated into Assyria and made their way as far as the borders of Egypt. Kala was burned, though the strong walls of Nineveh protected the relics of the Assyrian army which had taken refuge behind them. And when the raiders had passed on to other fields of booty, a new palace was erected among the ruins of the neighboring city. The last king of Assyria was probably the brother of Ashur-etil-ilani, Sin-sar-ixun, Sin-sara-ozor, who seems to have been the Saracus of Berosus. He was still reigning in Babylonia in his 70th year. Nabopolassar, now viceroy in Babylonia, fought against Sin-sar-ixun and the Scythian king of Ecbatana. The Cyaxares of the Greeks came to the help of the Babylonians. Nineveh was captured and destroyed by the Scythian army, along with those cities of northern Babylonia, which had sided with Babylonia, and the Assyrian Empire was at an end. The seat of the empire was now transferred to Babylonia. Nabopolassar was followed by his son Nebuchadnezzar II, whose reign of 43 years made Babylon once more the mistress of the civilized world. Only a small fragment of his annals has been discovered relating to his invasion of Egypt in 567 BC and referring to Phut of the Ionians. Of the reign of the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, however, and the conquest of Babylonia by Cyrus, we have a fair amount of information. This is chiefly derived from a chronological tablet containing the annals of Nabonidus, which is supplemented by an inscription of Nabonidus, in which he recounts his restoration of the temple of the moon god at Haran, as well as by a proclamation of Cyrus issued shortly after his formal recognition as king of Babylonia. It was in the 6th year of Nabonidus, 549 BC, or perhaps in 553, that Cyrus, king of Anshan in Elam, revolted against his suzerain Astyages, king of the Manda, or Scythians, at Ecbatana. The army of Astyages betrayed him to his enemy, and Cyrus established himself at Ecbatana, thus putting an end to the empire of the Scythians, which the Greek writers called that of the Medes, through a confusion of Mada, or Medes, with Manda. 3 years later, we find that Cyrus has become king of Persia, and is engaged in a campaign in the north of Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, Nabonidus has established a camp at Sippara, near the northern frontier of his kingdom, his son, probably Belshazzar, or other inscriptions, being in command of the army. In 538 BC, Cyrus invaded Babylonia. A battle was fought at Opis in the month of June, in which the Babylonians were defeated, and immediately afterwards Sippara surrendered to the invader. Nabonidus fled to Babylon, whither he was pursued by Gobryas, the governor of Kurdistan, and on the 16th of Tammuz, 2 days after the capture of Sippara, the soldiers of Cyrus entered Babylon without fighting. Nabonidus was dragged out of his hiding place, and Kurdish guards were placed at the gates of the great temple of Bel, where the services continued without intermission. Cyrus did not arrive until the 3rd of Marchesvan, October, Gobryas having acted for him in his absence. Gobryas was now made governor of the province of Babylon, and soon afterwards the son of Nabonidus, according to the most probable reading, died. On this day in history, October 13th, 54 AD, Roman Emperor Claudius dies from poisoning under mysterious circumstances. He is succeeded by his adoptive son Nero, rather than Britannicus, his son, with Messalina. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over Nero's succession. In 52, in Claudius's absence, Nero was prefect of the city. He married Claudius's daughter Octavia. On October 13, 54 AD, Claudius died, poisoned by Agrippina's orders, and Nero was presented to the soldiers on guard as their new sovereign. From the palace steps he proceeded to the Praetorian camp and thence to the Senate house, where he was made emperor. Agrippina's bold stroke had been completely successful. Only a few voices were raised for Britannicus, nor is there any doubt that Rome was prepared to welcome the new emperor with genuine enthusiasm. His prestige and his good qualities, carefully fostered by Seneca, made him popular, while his darker passions were as yet unsuspected. His first acts confirmed this favorable impression. He modestly declined the title Pater Patrae, the memory of Claudius, and that of his own father Domitius were duly honored. He promised to follow the principles of Augustus, and his clemency, liberality, and affability were the talk of Rome. Much of the credit of all this is due to Seneca and Burrus. Seneca had seen from the first that the real danger with Nero lay in the savage vehemence of his passions, and he made it his chief aim to stave off by every means in his power the dreaded outbreak. The policy of indulging his tastes and helping him to enjoy the sweets of popularity without the actual burdens of government succeeded for the time. During the first 5 years of his reign, little occurred to damp the popular enthusiasm. Nero's promises were fulfilled, and the Senate found itself free to discuss and even to decide important administrative questions. Abuses were remedied, the provincials protected from oppression, and the burdens of taxation lightened. On the frontiers, no serious disaster occurred, and even the murder of Britannicus was accepted as a necessary measure of self-defense. But an essential part of Seneca's policy was to remove Nero from the influence of his mother. On this day in history, October 14th, 1066, the Norman conquest of England begins with the Battle of Hastings. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. On September 28, 1066, William of Normandy, bent on asserting by arms his right to the English crown, landed at Pevensey. King Harold, who had destroyed the invaders of northern England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, on hearing the news, hurried southward, gathering what forces he could on the way. He took up his position athwart the road from Hastings to London, on a hill, some 6 miles inland from Hastings, with his back to the great fortress of Anderida, the Weald. and in front of him a long glacis-like slope, at the bottom of which began the slope of Telham Hill. The English army was composed almost entirely of infantry, the shire levies, for the most part destitute of body armor, and with miscellaneous and even improvised weapons were arranged on either flank of Harold's guards, huscarls, picked men armed principally with the Danish axe and shield. Before this position, Duke William appeared on the morning of October 14th. His host, composed not only of his Norman vassals, but of barons, knights, and adventurers from all quarters, was arranged in a centre and two wings, each corps having its archers and arbalists in the front line, the rest of the infantry in the second, and the heavy-armoured cavalry in the third. Neither the arrows nor the charge of the second line of footmen, who, unlike the English, wore defensive mail, made any impression on the English standing in a serried mass behind their interlocked shields. Then the heavy cavalry came on, led by the Duke and his brother Odo, and encouraged by the example of the minstrel Taillefer, who rode forward, tossing and catching his sword, into the midst of the English line before he was pulled down and killed. All along the front the cavalry came to close quarters with the defenders, but the long powerful Danish axes were as formidable as the halberd, and the bill proved to be in battles of later centuries, and they lopped off the arms of the assailants and cut down their horses. The fire of the attack died out, and the left wing, Bretons, fled in rout. But as the fitted levies broke out of the line and pursued the Bretons down the hill in a wild, formless mob, William's cavalry swung round and destroyed them, and this suggested to the Duke to repeat deliberately what the Bretons had done from fear. Another advance, followed by a feigned retreat, drew down a second large body of the English from the crest, and these in turn, once in the open, were ridden over and slaughtered by the men-at-arms. Lastly, these two disasters having weakened the defenders both martially and morally, William subjected the huscarls, who had stood fast when the fyrd broke its ranks, to a constant rain of arrows, varied from time to time by cavalry charges. These magnificent soldiers endeavoured the trial for many hours, from noon till close on nightfall, but at last, when the Norman archers raised their bows so as to pitch the arrows at a steep angle of descent in the midst of the huscarls, the strain became too great. While some rushed forward alone or in twos and threes to die in the midst of the enemy, the remainder stood fast, too closely crowded almost for the wounded to drop. At last Harold received a mortal wound, the English began to waver, and the knights forced their way in. Only a remnant of the defenders made its way back to the forest, and William, after resting for a night on the hardly won ground, began the work of the Norman conquest. Tactically, the battle was a victory for the skillful combination of horseman and archer, its effect increased by ruse over the infantrymen. On this day in history, October 15th, 1066, following the death of Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, Edgar the Atheling is proclaimed King of England by the Witan. He is never crowned, and concedes power to William the Conqueror 2 months later. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the would-be king. Edgar, or Edgar, circa 1050 to circa 1130, called the Atheling, was the son of Edward, the exile, a son of the English king Edmund Ironside, by his wife Agatha, a kinswoman of the Emperor Henry II, and was born probably in Hungary some time before 1057, the year of his father's death. After the death of Harold in 1066, Eadwine and Morkere desired to make him king, but on the advance of William I, Edgar and his supporters made their submission. He took part in 2 unsuccessful risings in the north, 1068 and 1069, afterwards taking refuge in Scotland, where his sister Margaret married the Scottish king Malcolm Kenmure. In 1074 he went to Normandy and made peace with William. In 1097 he made a successful attempt to set his nephew Edgar on the throne of Scotland, and in 1099 went to the Crusade. He returned to England in Henry I's reign, but sided with Robert of Normandy against the king in their last war, and was taken prisoner at the Battle of Tinchebra in 1106. He was soon released, and lived in obscurity until his death, the date of which is uncertain. On this day in history, October 16th, 456, Ricimer defeats Avitus at Piacenza, and becomes master of the Western Roman Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the master. Ricimer died 472, master of the Roman Empire in the West. During the part of the 5th century, was the son of a prince of the Suebi and the daughter of Wallia, king of the Visigoths. His youth was spent at the court of Valentinian III, and he won distinction under Aetius. In 456 he defeated the Vandals in a sea fight near Corsica, and on land near Agrigentum in Sicily. He then gained the consent of the Roman Senate to an expedition against the Roman Emperor Avitus, whom he defeated at Piacenza on October 16, 456. Ricimer then obtained from Leo I, emperor at Constantinople, the title patrician, but in 457 set up Majorianus as his own emperor in the west. When, however, Majorianus tried to rule by himself, Ricimer forced him to abdicate and caused his assassination on August 7, 461. The successor whom Ricimer placed upon the throne was Libius Severus, who proved to be more docile than Majorianus. Upon his death in 465, said to be due to the poison of Ricimer, this emperor-maker ruled the West for 18 months without an emperor, and then accepted Leo's candidate Anthemius. Before long, however, Ricimer moved to Milan, ready to declare war on Anthemius. St. Epiphanius, bishop of Milan, patched up a truce, but in 472 Ricimer proclaimed as emperor Olybrius, whom Leo had sent to pacify the two enemies, and after 3 months' siege captured Rome on July 1, 472. Anthemius was massacred, and Rome was a prey to Ricimer's soldiers. He himself, however, died on August 18, 472, of a malignant fever. On this day in history, October 17, 1346, the English capture King David II of Scotland at Neville's Cross and imprison him for 11 years. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Neville's Cross. This battle, on October 17, 1346, took place after Crécy, and while Edward III was still abroad besieging Calais. It foiled the opportunist Scottish invasion, and assured Edward's freedom to continue his French projects, but its main interest in military history is that it affords an example of the offensive power of the new tactical combination of archers and spearmen, in contrast to Duplin, Halidon Hill, Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, which were all won by awaiting the enemy's onslaught. After crossing the border, King David Bruce was surprised by the quickness with which the English under William de la Zouch, Archbishop of York, concentrated to meet him. Driven to accept battle near Durham, the Scottish king took up his position to resist attack. His pikemen formed in 3 great schiltrons. The English advanced, with their left heading, and the archers on this wing overlapped and swarmed round the Scottish right flank schiltron. When this broke under the arrow storm, they closed on the center schiltron, already attacked in front. Its collapse in turn under the converging pressure led to the capture of the king and the hurried retreat of the remaining left division of pikemen. Thus the archers proved their power against an immobile foe to pave the way for a successful assault by knights and men-at-arms. On this day in history, October 18th, 33 AD, heartbroken by the deaths of her sons Nero and Drusus, and banished to the island of Pandateria by Tiberius, Agrippina the Elder dies of self-inflicted starvation. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Agrippina. Agrippina the Elder, daughter of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, by his third wife Julia, was the granddaughter of Augustus and the wife of Germanicus. She accompanied her husband to Germany when the legions on the Rhine revolted after the death of Augustus, 14 AD. 3 years later she was in the east with Germanicus, who died at Antioch in 19, poisoned, it was said, by the orders of Calpurnius Piso, governor of Syria. Eager to avenge his death, she returned to Rome and boldly accused Piso of the murder of Germanicus. To avoid public infamy, Piso committed suicide. Tiberius and his favorite, Sejanus, feared that her ambition might lead her to attempt to secure the throne for her children, and she was banished to the island of Pandateria, off the coast of Campania, where she died on October 18, 33, starved to death by herself, or, according to some, by order of Tiberius. 2 of her sons, Nero and Drusus, had already fallen victims to the machinations of Sejanus. Agrippina had a large family by Germanicus, several of whom died young, while only 2 are of importance, Agrippina the Younger and Gaius Caesar, who succeeded Tiberius under the name of Caligula. There is a portrait of Agrippina in the Capitoline Museum at Rome and a bronze medal in the British Museum, representing the bringing back of her ashes to Rome under order of Caligula. On this day in history, October 19th, 202 BC, as part of the Second Punic War, at the Battle of Zama, Roman legions under Scipio Africanus defeat Hannibal Barca, leader of the army defending Carthage. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle Zama, 202 BC. One of the most decisive battles in military history in its military result, Zama ranks above any, save perhaps Waterloo, for its decisive effect on the course of world history. For the defeat of Hannibal, the first and only true defeat in his career, left Carthage naked, and her surrender put an end to the long struggle between Rome and Carthage for the mastery of the Mediterranean world. The prologue to Zama had been the invasion of Africa by Scipio, almost in defiance of the Roman Senate, which wished him instead to attack Hannibal, who still stood unconquerable in southern Italy. In Africa, Scipio's brilliant series of victories over less formidable generals had forced Carthage to sue for peace before Hannibal could answer the summons of recall. But while the peace negotiations were being conducted in Rome, Hannibal landed at Leptis, whereupon the Carthaginians broke this truce, and Scipio's military position was gravely compromised. Isolated on hostile soil, and with part of his force detached to assist his ally Massinissa in securing his new kingdom of Numidia, instead of awaiting Hannibal near Carthage, Scipio cut himself off from his base and marched on a divergent path into the interior. Security lies often in calculated audacity, and as analysis of the military problems makes it highly probable that his march inland up the Bagridas Valley was aimed, by its menace to which the interior, on which Carthage depended for supplies, to force Hannibal to push west to meet him instead of north to Carthage. By this clever move he threatened the economic base at Carthage, and protected his own, also luring Hannibal away from his military base, Carthage. A complementary purpose was that this line of movement brought him progressively nearer to Numidia, shortening the distance which Massinissa would have to traverse with his expected reinforcement of strength. It had the intended effect, for the Carthaginians sent urgent appeals to Hannibal to advance towards Scipio and bring him to battle, and within a few days he marched west and arrived by forced marches at Zama. He then sent out scouts to discover the Roman camp and its dispositions for defense. It lay some miles farther west. Almost coincidentally, Massinissa arrived with 6,000 horse and 4,000 foot, and Scipio then broke up his camp and moved to a fresh site near the town of Narragara. His position being well chosen tactically, and having water within a javelin's throw, Hannibal also moved his camp forward to meet him. A parley between the two commanders led to no result, and both thereupon prepared to decide the issue by arms. The dispositions made by the rival leaders have several features of note. Scipio placed his heavy Roman foot, he had probably 2 legions, in the center. Laelius, with the Italian cavalry on the left wing, and on the right wing Massinissa, with the whole of the Numidians horse and foot. Heavy infantry were drawn up in the normal 3 lines. First, the hastati, then the princeps, and finally, the turiari. But instead of adopting the usual checker formation with the manipoles of the second line opposite to and covering the intervals between the manipoles of the first line, he ranged the manipoles forming the rear lines directly behind the respective manipoles of the first line, thus forming wide lanes between each 2 cohorts. The Carthaginian had 80 elephants, more than any previous battle, and in order to terrify the enemy he placed them in front of his line. Supporting them, in the first line, were the Ligurian and Gallic mercenaries, intermixed with Balearic and Moorish light troops. In the second line were the Carthaginian and African levies, their combined strength probably exceeding that of the first line. Finally, Hannibal's own troops from Italy formed the third line, held back more than 200 distance from the others, in order evidently to keep it as an intact reserve. On the wings Hannibal disposed his cavalry, the Numidian allies on the left, and the Carthaginian horse on the right. His total force was probably in excess of 50,000, perhaps 55,000. The Roman strength is less certain. But if we assume that each of Scipio's 2 legions was duplicated by an equal body of Italian allies, and add Messenica's 10,000, the complete strength would be about 36,000. The battle opened, after preliminary skirmishing, with Hannibal's order to the drivers of the elephants to charge the Roman line. Scipio promptly countered by a blast of trumpets along the whole line. The strident clamor so startled and terrified the elephants that many of them at once turned back on their own troops. This was especially the case on the left wing, where they threw the Numidians, Hannibal's best cavalry wing, into disorder just as they were advancing to the attack. Messenica seized this golden opportunity to launch a counterstroke, which inevitably threw the disorganized opponents. With Messenica in hot pursuit, they were driven from the field, and so left the Carthaginian left wing exposed. The remainder of the elephants wrought much havoc among Scorpio's velites, caught by their charge in front of the Roman line, but the foresight that had provided the lanes and laid down the method of withdrawal was justified by its results, for the elephants took the line of least resistance, penetrating into the lanes rather than facing the firm-knit ranks of the heavy infantry maniples. Once in these lanes, the velites, who had retired into the lateral passages between the lines, bombarded them with darts from both sides. Their reception was far too warm for them to linger when the door of escape was held wide open. While some of the elephants rushed right through harmlessly and out to the open in rear of the Roman army, others were driven back out of the lanes and fled towards the Carthaginian right wing. It was at this moment that Laelius, availing himself of the disturbance created by the elephants, charged the Carthaginian cavalry and forced them to a headlong fight. He pressed the pursuit closely, as likewise did Messenica. Both Hannibal's flanks were thus stripped bare. In the meantime, the infantry of both armies had slowly advanced on each other, except that Hannibal kept his third line back. At first the Gauls and Ligurians had the balance of advantage through their personal skill in skirmishing and more rapid movement, but the Roman line remained unbroken, and the weight of their compact formation pushed the enemy back despite losses. Another factor told. For a while, the leading Romans were encouraged by the shouts from the rear lines coming on to back them up. Hannibal's second line, the Carthaginians, failed to support the Gauls, but hung back in order to keep their ranks firm. Forced steadily back and feeling they had been left in the lurch by their own side, the Gauls turned about and fled. When they tried to seek shelter in the second line, they were repulsed by the Carthaginians, who deemed it essential to avoid any disarray which might enable the Romans to penetrate their line. In a short time the relics of the first line had dispersed completely, or disappeared round the flanks of the second line. The latter, however, showed their fighting quality by thrusting back the Roman first line, the hastati. In this they were helped by a human obstacle, the ground encumbered with corpses and slippery with blood, which disordered the ranks of the attacking Romans. Even the princeps had begun to waver when they saw the first line driven back so decisively, but their officers rallied them, and led them forward in the nick of time to restore the situation. This reinforcement was decisive. Hemmed in, because the Roman formation produced a longer frontage and so overlapped their line, the Carthaginians were steadily cut to pieces. The survivors fled back on the relatively distant third line, but Hannibal continued his policy of refusing to allow the fugitives to mix with and disrupt an ordered line. The curtain now rose on what was practically a fresh battle. The Romans had penetrated to their real antagonists, men equal to them in the nature of their arms, in their experience of war, in the fame of their achievements. Livy's tribute is borne out by the fierceness and the long uncertain issue of the subsequent conflict, which refutes the suggestion that Hannibal's old guard was but a shadow of its former power. In the days of Trasimenus and Cannae, the Romans had the moral advantage of having routed two successive lines, as well as the cavalry and elephants, but they had now to face a compact and fresh body of probably 24,000 veterans, under the direct inspiration of Hannibal, and no man in history has shown a more dynamic personality in infusing his own determination in his troops. The Romans, too, had at last a numerical advantage, not large, however. The forces were nearly equal in numbers, according to Polybius, and in reality still less than it appeared. For while all Hannibal's third line were fresh, on Scipio's side only the Trarari had not been engaged, and these represented but half the strength of the hastati, or princeps. Further, the velites had been so badly mauled that they had to be relegated to the reserve, and the cavalry were off the field, engaged in the pursuit. Thus it is improbable that Scipio had at his disposal for this final blow more than 18,000 or 20,000 infantry, less the casualties these had already suffered. His next step is characteristic of the man, of his cool calculation, even in the heart of a battle crisis. He sounded the recall to his leading troops, and then, in face of an enemy at hardly more than a bow-shot distance, he not only reorganized his troops, but reconstructed his dispositions. His problem was this: against the first two enemy lines, the Roman formation, shallower than the Carthaginian phalanx, and with intervals, had occupied a wider frontage, and so enabled him to overlap theirs. Now, against a body double the strength, his frontage was no longer, and perhaps less than, Hannibal's. His appreciation evidently took in this favor, and with it two others. First, that in order to concentrate his missile shock power for the final effort, it would be wise to make his line as solid as possible, and this could be done because there was no longer need for or advantage in retaining intervals between the maniples. Second, that as his cavalry would be returning any moment, there was no advantage in keeping the orthodox formation in depth and using the princeps and triarii as a direct support and reinforcement to his front line. The blow should be as concentrated as possible in time, and as wide as possible in striking force rather than a series of efforts. He therefore made his hastati close up to form a compact center without intervals. Similarly, he closed each half of his princeps and triarii outwards, and moved them forward to extend the flank on either wing. He now once more overlapped the hostile front. The role of Scipio's infantry in the final phase was to fix Hannibal's force ready for the decisive maneuver to be delivered by the cavalry. For this role, violence and wildness of onslaught was more important than sustenance. Scipio made his redistribution deliberately and unhurriedly. The longer he could delay the final tussle, the more time he gained for the return of his cavalry. It is not unlikely that Massinissa and Laelius pressed the pursuit rather too far, and so caused an unnecessary strain on the Roman infantry and on Scipio's plan. For Polybius tells us that when the rival infantries met, the contest was for long doubtful, the men falling where they stood out of determination, until Massinissa and Laelius arrived providentially at the proper moment. Their charge, in the enemy's rear, clinched the decision, and though most of Hannibal's men fought grimly to the end, they were cut down in their ranks. Of those who took the flight, few escaped. The completeness of the victory left no room for a strategic pursuit, but Scipio did not linger in developing the moral exploitation of his victory. An immediate move on Carthage achieved its object, a bloodless capitulation. On this day in history, October 20th, 1740, France, Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony refused to honor the Pragmatic Sanction, and the War of the Austrian Succession begins. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the term of the sanction. Pragmatic Sanction, originally a term of the later Roman law, is found in the Theodosian and Justinian codes. Latin, Pragmatia Sanctio, from the Greek, business. It was a decision of the state with some interest greater than a question in dispute between private persons, and was given for some community, universitas hominum, and for the public cause. In more recent times, it was adopted by those countries which followed the Roman law, and in particular by despotically governed countries, to signify an expression of the will of the sovereign, defining the limits of his own power or regulating the succession. Justinian regulated the government of Italy by pragmatic sanctions after it had been reconquered from the Ostrogoths. In after the kings of France, Charles VII, imposed limits on the claims of the Pope to exercise jurisdiction in his domains by the pragmatic sanction of Bourges in 1438. The Emperor Charles VI settled the law of succession for the dominions of the House of Habsburg by pragmatic sanction that was first published on April 19, 1713. Philip V, the first of the Bourbon kings of Spain, introduced the Salic law by a pragmatic sanction, and his descendant, Ferdinand VII, revoked it by another. The term was not used in England. On this day in history, October 21st, 310, 65 days after being exiled by the Emperor Maxentius to Sicily, Pope Eusebius dies. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Pope. Eusebius, Bishop of Rome for 4 months under Emperor Maxentius, in 309 or 310. The Christians in Rome divided on the question of the reconciliation of apostates, on which Eusebius held the milder view, brought forward a competitor, Heraclius. Both competitors were expelled by the emperor. Eusebius was buried in St. Calixtus at Rome. The epitaph, in 8 hexameter lines, set up by his successor Damascus, contains all the available information. On this day in history, October 22nd, 794, Japanese Emperor Kanmu relocates his empire's capital to Heiankyo, now Kyoto. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the capital. Kyoto, the former capital of Japan in the province of Yamashiro, in 35 degrees 1 minute north, 135 degrees 46 minutes east. Population from 1940, 1,089,726. The Kamogawa, upon which it stands, is a mere rivulet in ordinary times, trickling through a wide bed of pebbles, but the city is traversed by several aqueducts, and was connected with Lake Biwa in 1890 by a canal 6 7/8 miles long, which carries an abundance of water for manufacturing purposes, brings the Great Lake and the city into navigable communication. The forms with the Kamogawa Canal and the Kamogawa itself a through route to Osaka, from which Kyoto is 25 miles distant by rail. Founded in the year 793, Kyoto remained the capital of the empire during nearly 11 centuries. In its days of greatest prosperity, Kyoto contained only 500,000 inhabitants, and the emperor Kuamu called it Heianjo, or the City of Peace, when he made it the seat of government. But the people knew it as Miyako, or Kyoto, both terms signifying capital. And in modern times it is often spoken of as Saikyo, or Western capital, in opposition to Tokyo, or Eastern capital. Magnificent temples and shrines, grand monuments of architectural and artistic skill, beautiful gardens, gorgeous festivals, and numerous ateliers, where the traditions of Japanese art are obeyed with attractive results, offer to the foreign visitor a fund of interest. The city is still a Buddhist stronghold of Japan, and the main products are porcelain, embroidery, brocades, bronzes, enamelware, and fans. On this day in history, October 23rd, 42 BC, as part of the Liberators' Civil War, Mark Antony and Octavian decisively defeat an army under Brutus in the second part of the Battle of Philippi, with Brutus committing suicide and ending the Civil War. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Philippi, a city of ancient Macedonia, on a steep hill near the river Gangetes, modern Angista, overlooking an extensive coastal plain on the highway between Neapolis, Kavala, and Thessalonica. Originally called Cranides, fountains, it was fortified by Philip II of Macedon to command the neighboring gold mines. In 42 BC, after the defeat of Brutus and Cassius here by Octavius and Antony, it became a Roman colony, Colonia Julia Philippinis, probably increased after the Battle of Actium, Colonia Augustus Julia Philippinis, with the Jus Italicum and the rank of a first city. It was twice visited by St. Paul, whose epistle to the Philippians was addressed to converts here. The site, now uninhabited, is marked by ruins of an amphitheater and a great temple with inscriptions. To the east is the huge monument of C. Vibius, known to the Turks as Dikliashar, and to the Greeks as the Manger of Bucephalus. On this day in history, October 24th, 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny is ratified, marking the end of the first phase of the 100 Years' War. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the hamlet. Bretigny, French hamlet, department of Eure-et-Loir, arrondissement and canton of Chartres, commune of Suze, which gave its name of a treaty concluded here on May 8, 1360, between Edward III of England and John II of France. Edward III obtained, besides Guienne and Gascony, Poitou, Saintonge, and Aunis, Angenay, Perigord, Limousin, Quercy, Bigorre, the courtship of Guerre, Angomore, Rogarou, Montreuil-sur-Mer, Ponthieu, Calais, Sangat, Ham, and the courtship of Guines. John II had, moreover, to pay 3 million gold crowns for his ransom. On his side, the King of England gave up the duchies of Normandy and Touraine, the courtships of Anjou and Maine, and the suzerainty of Brittany and of Flanders. The treaty should more properly be called the Treaty of Calais, since it was ratified there on October 24th, when an important clause in the Treaty of Bretigny was omitted. On this day in history, October 25th, 285 or 286, the execution of Saints Crispin and Crispinian during the reign of Diocletian, now the patron saints of leatherworkers, curriers, and shoemakers. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the saints. Crispin and Crispinian, the patron saints of shoemakers whose feast falls on October 25th, have a legendary history traceable to the 8th century. It is said that they were brothers of a noble Roman family, and that they traveled to Soissons, where they supported themselves by shoemaking and made many converts. The Emperor Maximianus Herculeus condemned them to death, but they escaped from the ordeals imposed by his prefect Rectio Varus. At last Maximian had their heads cut off, circa 286. Their remains were buried at Soissons, but were afterwards removed, partly by Charlemagne, to Ossenbruck, and partly to the chapel of St. Lawrence in Rome. There are also relics at Fulda, and a Kentish tradition claims that their bodies were cast into the sea and floated ashore at Romney Marsh. In France, especially, the festival of St. Crispin was for centuries the occasion of solemn processions and merrymaking, in which guilds of shoemakers took the chief part. In England, the day acquired additional importance as the anniversary of Agincourt. On this day in history, October 26th, 1341, the Byzantine Civil War of 1341 to 1347 formally begins with the proclamation of John VI Cantacozenos as Byzantine Emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. John VI, or Fifth, circa 1292 to 1383, surnamed Cantacuzene, East Roman Emperor, was born at Constantinople, connected with the house of Palaeologus on his mother's side, on the accession of Germanicus III, 1328. He was entrusted with the supreme administration of affairs. On Germanicus's death in 1341, Cantacuzene was left regent and guardian of his 9-year-old son, John Palaeologus. Being suspected by the empress and opposed by a powerful party at court, he rebelled and got himself crowned emperor at Didymatikos in Thrace, while John Palaeologus and his supporters maintained themselves at Constantinople. The civil war which ensued lasted 6 years, during which the rival parties called in the aid of the Serbians and Turks and engaged mercenaries of every description. It was only by the aid of the Turks, with whom he made a disgraceful bargain, that Cantacuzene brought the war to a termination favorable to himself. In 1347 he entered Constantinople in triumph, and forced his opponents to an arrangement by which he became joint emperor with John Palaeologus, and sole administrator during the minority of his colleague. During this period, the empire, already broken up and reduced to the narrowest limits, was assailed on every side. There were wars with the Genoese, who had a colony at Galata, and had money transactions with the court, and with the Serbians, who were at that time establishing an extensive empire on the northwestern frontiers, and there was a hazardous alliance with the Turks, who made their first permanent settlement in Europe, at Callipolis in Thrace, towards the end of the reign, 1354. Cantacuzene was far too ready to invoke the aid of foreigners in his European quarrels, and as he had no money to pay them, this gave them a ready pretext for seizing upon a European town. Heavy taxation caused discontent, and a strong party had always favored John Palaeologus, who entered Constantinople at the end of 1354. Cantacuzene retired to a monastery where he assumed the name Joseph Christodoulos and occupied himself in literary labors. He died in the Peloponnese and was buried at Misithra in Laconia. His history, in 4 books, deals with the years 1320 to 1356. On this day in history, October 27th, 1275, the traditional founding of the city of Amsterdam. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Amsterdam, the chief city of Holland in the province of North Holland on the south side of the Y, or Ige, an arm of the Zuiderzee, in 52 degrees 22 minutes north and 4 degrees 53 minutes east. Population, from 1939, 793,526. It has communications by railway and canal in every direction. Steam tramways connected with Edam, Purmerend, Alkmaar, and Hilversum, and electric railways with Haarlem and the seaside resort of Zandvoort. Amsterdam, the dam or dike of the Amstel, is so called from the Amstel, the canalized river which passes through the city to the Y. Its beginnings center around a small sea fishing settlement. In the 13th century, it was held in fee by the lords of Amstel of the bishops of Utrecht, and in 1204 Gizebrecht II built a castle here. A little later, Gizebrecht III constructed a dam to keep out the sea, and around the castle and dam the city grew. The first mention of the town is in 1275 in a charter of Floris IV, Count of Holland, exempting it from certain taxes. In 1296, the place passed out of the hands of the lords of Amstel, owing to the part taken by Gizebrecht IV in the murder of Count Floris V. Count John died 1304, with the approval of the Bishop of Utrecht, bestowed the fief on his brother, Guy of Hainault. Guy gave the town its first charter in 1300, with a bailiff, Schot, and judicial assessors, Scabini or Schopenen, the overlord supremacy being guarded, and an appeal lying from the Scabini, in cases of disagreement, to Utrecht. In 1342, more extensive privileges were granted by Count William IV, including the freedom from tolls by land and water in return for certain annual dues. In 1483, the town was surrounded with walls. During the religious troubles of the 16th century, its prosperity increased owing to influx of refugees from Antwerp and Brabant. Amsterdam, influenced by its trading interests, did not join the other towns in revolt against Spain until 1578. In 1587, the Earl of Leicester made an unsuccessful attempt to seize it. The greatest development of Amsterdam was due, however, to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, by which its rival, Antwerp, was ruined, owing to the closing of the Scheldt. The city held out obstinately against the stadholders, and in 1650 opened the dikes to prevent William II seizing it. The same device was successful against Louis XIV in 1672, and Amsterdam, now reconciled with the stadholder, was one of the staunchest supporters of William III against France. In 1787, Amsterdam was occupied by the Prussians, and in 1795 by the French under Pichegru. It was then made capital of the Batavian Republic and afterwards of the Kingdom of Holland. In 1810, this was united with the French Empire, and Amsterdam was recognized officially as its third town following Paris and Rome. The modern city has been built to a great extent over boggy ground, and the foundations of the buildings were made secure by driving long piles into the firm clayey soil below. The city suffered only slight damage during the 5-day German attack on the Netherlands in May 1940. On the landward side, the city is surrounded by a fosse or canal, and was at one time fortified, but the ramparts have been demolished and replaced by gardens and houses. One gateway, the Mudirpoort, still stands. Within the city are 4 canals, Grachten, with their ends resting on the Y, extending in polygonal crescents nearly parallel to each other and to the outer canal. Lesser canals intersect the others radially, thus virtually dividing the city into a number of islands. The nucleus of the town lies within the innermost crescent canal, and with the large square. The dam, in the center, represents the area of Amsterdam about the middle of the 14th century. At one end of the enclosing canal is the Strijgerstoren, 1482, or Weeper's Tower, on the ancient harbor, the scene of former sorrowful leave-takings. Between this and the next crescent, Herengracht, there sprang up, on the east, the foreign quarter where the large Jewish population is located and where Rembrandt lived, 1640 to 1656. And Spinoza was born, 1632. Beyond the Herengracht lies the Keizersgracht and the Prinsengracht, respectively. And these three celebrated canals, with their tree-board quays and old-fashioned houses, form the principal thoroughfares of the city. West of the Prinsengracht lies the district called Des Jardins, a corruption of Les Jardins, for its streets are named after various flowers. It was formed by the settlement of French refugees after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. The outermost crescent canal is called the Single Girdle, and marks the boundary of the city at the end of the 17th century. The city's long connection with the sea produced its seamen, merchants, and explorers. With the accumulation of mercantile wealth, coupled with a tradition of keenness of mind and action, enhanced by the arrival of refugees, the city became the home of artists, philosophers, and religious leaders. Around the dam are the Nieuwe Kerk and the palace. The palace, in classical style, was originally built as a town hall in 1648 to 1655 by von Kampen. After 1768, it was used as a royal residence. The exterior is beautifully decorated. The great hall is lined with white Italian marble, and in spite of its enormous dimensions, the roof is unsupported by pillars. The Nieuwe Kerk, St. Catherine's, is a fine Gothic building dating from 1408. Internally, it is remarkable for its remains of ancient stained glass, fine carvings, and interesting monuments, including one to the famous Admiral de Ruyter, died 1676. The New Exchange, 1901, lies between the dam and the Central Station, 1889. The Oude Kerk, St. Nicholas, so called, circa 1300, contains some beautiful stained glass of the 16th and 17th centuries, by Pieter Artsen of Amsterdam, 1508 to 1575, and others. One window contains the arms of the burgomasters of Amsterdam, from 1578 to 1767. The North Church was the last one of the architect Hendrik de Keyser, 1565 to 1621, of Utrecht. The Roman Catholic Church of St. Nicholas, 1886, replaced a common dwelling house, now the Museum Amstelkering of Ecclesiastical Antiquities. Among the Jewish synagogues, the largest is that of the Portuguese Jews, 1670. The St. Antoine Swag, built as a town gate, 1488 to 1585, contains the city's archives, and the Trippenhuis, the Royal Society of Science, Letters, and Fine Arts. The Rijks, or State Museum, is a finely situated building in the Dutch Renaissance style, erected in 1876 to 1885. It has a department of general antiquities and a large gallery of pictures of Dutch and Flemish schools. Famous pictures in the Rijksmuseum are those of the Tippenhuis, the so-called Night Watch, and the Syndics of the Cloth Hall by Rembrandt, and the Banquet of the Civic Guard by Van der Helst. The Tippenhuis gallery consisted of the pictures brought from The Hague by Louis Bonaparte, King of Holland, and belonging to the collection of the Orange family dispersed during the Napoleonic period. The Municipal Museum contains a collection of furniture and paintings, including an outstanding collection of Van Gogh. The Joseph Fodor Museum, 1860, contains modern French and Dutch pictures. The pictures collected by Burgomaster Jan VI, died 1702, are, except for the family Rembrandts, in the Rijksmuseum. The Willet Huythuisen Museum, 1895, has exhibits of furniture and porcelain. Modern Amsterdam extends southward beyond the Single. In the middle of the new region lies the Vondel Park, named after the great national poet Just van den Vondel, died 1679, whose statue stands therein. The Willems Park adjoining was added later. In the older part of the town, the chief open space is the Zoological Gardens in the northeast corner, set out by the Natura Artis Magistra Society in 1838, which are well known. There is attached a library and an ethnological and natural history museum. Nearby are the botanical gardens. The public squares include the Sophia Plein, with the picturesque Mint Tower, the Rembrandt Plein, with a monument to the painter, the Thorbeckenplein, and the Liedschiplein, with the large theater, rebuilt in 1890 to 94 after a fire. There are two universities, the Free University, 1880, and the more ancient Municipal University of Amsterdam, founded in 1632, but reconstructed in 1887. In addition to the numerous science laboratories, the State University possesses a very fine library of about 100,000 volumes, including the Rosenthal collection of over 8,000 books on Jewish literature. The Society for Public Welfare, 1785, promotes the education and improvement of all classes, and has branches all over Holland. Among other societies are the Felix Mertus, 1776, and the Arti et Armicitie, 1839, whose art exhibitions are of a high order. At the Concertgebouw, erected in 1888, the famous Concertgebouw Orchestra gives its concerts. Amsterdam is the seat of a superior court and a court. On this day in history, October 28th, 97 AD, Roman Emperor Nerva is forced by the Praetorian Guard to adopt General Marcus Ulpius Trajanus as his heir and successor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of the future emperor. Trajan, Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, 53 AD to 117. Roman emperor, was born at Italica, in Spain, on September 18, 53. The family to which he belonged was probably Italian by blood. His father began as a common legionary soldier and fought his way up to the consulship and the governorship of Asia. The younger Trajan was a soldier born and bred. For 10 years he was a military tribune, serving all over the empire. Then he held important posts in Syria and Spain. By 89 he had a considerable military reputation. In that year he was ordered from further Spain to the Rhine to deal with the revolt of Saturnius. He covered the distance very quickly, but the rebellion had been crushed before his arrival. He was consul in 91. Nerva, on his accession, made him consular legate of Upper Germany, and on the advice of Licinius Sura, adopted him as his son and successor on October 27, 97. The Senate confirmed the choice and acknowledged him as the successor. Trajan, at the time, was in Germany. Shortly afterwards, at Cologne, he received news of the emperor's death, January 25, 98. Trajan's authority was at once acknowledged all over the empire. He gave the Senate an assurance that, like that given by Nerva, that he would neither kill nor degrade any senator, and ordered the foundation of a temple and cult in honor of his adoptive father, but he did not come to Rome till he had inspected the Rhine-Danube frontier. The Praetorians, who had been a menace to Nerva, were quickly overawed, and he proceeded to make his long-awaited entry into Rome. Here he at once made himself popular with both Senate and people. Soon afterwards he left for his first Dacian campaign. It would appear that Trajan himself wrote an account of this war, but only one sentence has survived. We are left with the evidence of Trajan's column and the monuments at Adamclisi. This much may be said. Roman prestige and security were threatened by the terms of peace exacted by Decebalus from Domitian. Trajan took the initiative in 101. His advance, more or less unopposed at first, ended in an indecisive battle at Tepe, at the entrance to the Iron Gate Pass. Trajan retired to winter on the Danube. The winter seems to have been disturbed by a raid by Dacians and Roxolani into Moesia. The next spring, Trajan invaded Dacia again. His advance ended in an attack on a stronghold, identified as Muncelketate, and a complete victory near Koztest. Decebalus surrendered, and a garrison was left in Sarmiz-Getsusa, and Trajan withdrew. In 105, Decebalus revolted, and again, probably, invaded Moesia. Trajan started at once from Ancona, and seems to have spent the first season in Moesia, making his way to his bridge at Pontes and wintering there. The next year, 106, after prolonged and desperate fighting, Sarmiz-Getsusa was taken, and Decebalus committed suicide. Dacia was annexed, the capital became a colony, Oppia Triana, and the new province was gradually Romanized in the usual way. There followed 7 years of peace, broken at last by war with Parthia. The casus belli was the appointment by the new king of Parthia, Khosrow, of a nephew to the throne of Armenia without the customary application to Rome. But there must have been something behind that, for Khosrow's instant apology failed to placate Trajan. There were 3 campaigns. The first, 114, resulted in the annexation of Armenia almost without opposition. The next year, still without much fighting, Trajan occupied Mesopotamia up to the Tigris. There he halted and went to Antioch for the winter. In 116, he first marched through Edessa and Nisibis, forced the passage of the Tigris without difficulty, and annexed Adiabene, which became the province of Assyria. Then he turned down the Tigris to Ctesiphon. Khosrow fled, and Trajan went on downstream to the shores of the Persian Gulf, where he looked over the waters to India and said, sadly, "If only I were younger." The captured territory became the province of Parthia. Then, on the way back, the trouble started. Before the end of the year, a serious rising in the north had to be crushed, and the Parthians were threatening a counterattack. Trajan decided to abandon Lower Mesopotamia, installed the young prince Parthomasipatis as king in Ctesiphon, and withdrew, not without trouble on the way. Meanwhile, the Jews all over the east had risen and massacred everyone they could find, Greeks and Romans alike. Trajan, alarmed by this and other signs of trouble all over the empire, set out for Rome. He died on the way, at Selinus, in Cilicia, on August 8, 117. His reign closes ominously. While he had been in the east, trouble had started in Africa, Egypt, Libya, Palestine, Sarmatia, Britain. He was deified, of course, and his triumph was celebrated after his death. Trajan's reign takes one more long step towards complete despotism, which we shall see when we consider the provinces. For Italy, Trajan did much. His new forum was the glory of Rome. There are columns and triumphal arches to commemorate his victories. He reclaimed the Campagna, built new harbors at Ostia, Centum Sale, and Ancona, built roads and aqueducts, and tried to arrest the decline of Italy in agriculture and manpower by extending the alimenta system of Nerva, forbidding emigration, encouraging settlements on the imperial lands, making senators invest in real estate in Italy, and so on. His provincial administration is a little less easy to summarize. In intention, it was excellent, but his long absence in the east led to difficulties. Numerous prosecutions for extortion show the extent of the evil and the emperor's efforts to stop it. This reign sees also a new phenomenon, the breakdown of local government on the financial side. Various municipalities have to receive curators, and the province of Bithynia and the free cities of Achaia had their financial administration taken over by imperial correctores. Pliny was sent to Bithynia, and his letters to Trajan and the replies are preserved. In the numerous massive detail referred to the emperor, we can see foreshadowed the complete centralization that was to come under Diocletian. Mention must also be made of the view that Trajan's wars were completely disastrous to the empire, overstraining its manpower and economic strength irrevocably. On this day in history, October 29th, 1792, Mount Hood in Oregon is named after Samuel Hood, 1st Viscount Hood, by Lieutenant William E. Broughton, who sighted the mountain near the mouth of the Willamette River. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the mountain. Mount Hood, a peak of the Cascade Range in Clackamas and Hood River counties, Oregon, about 50 miles east of Portland. It is an extinct volcanic cone of great symmetrical beauty rising to a height of 11,253 feet above sea level, the highest point in the state. The peak was built upon the comparatively level back of the range, which is about 4,000 feet, by successive volcanic eruptions. The summit is a part of the rim of the ancient crater. Steam jets and fumaroles still exist about crater rock. Its crest, clad in perpetual ice and snow, gives rise to 8 glaciers which extends down its sides to an elevation of about 6,000 feet above the sea. Mount Hood was first discovered in 1792 by a member of Vancouver's exploring expedition and was named in honor of Rear Admiral Samuel Hood of the British Admiralty. The first successful ascent was made on August 4, 1854, from the south side, by a party under Captain Barlow, builder of the Pioneer Road to Oregon. It is now more frequently climbed than any other snow peak in America. On this day in history, October 30th, 1831, Nat Turner is arrested for leading the bloodiest slave rebellion in United States history. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Turner. Nat Turner, born 1800, died 1831, the Negro leader of a slave insurrection in Virginia, known as the Southampton Insurrection, was born in Southampton County, Virginia, in 1800. From his childhood, he claims to see visions and hear voices, and he became a Baptist preacher of great influence among the Negroes. In 1828, he confided to a few companions that a voice from heaven had announced that the last shall be first, which was interpreted to mean that the slaves should control. An insurrection was planned, and a solar eclipse in February 1831 and peculiar atmospheric conditions of August 13th were accepted as the signal for beginning the work. On the night of August 21st, 1831, with 7 companions, he entered the house of his master, Joseph Travis, and murdered the inmates. After securing guns, horses, and liquor, they visited other houses, sparing no one. Recruits were added, in some cases by compulsion, until the band numbered about 60. About noon on the 22nd, they were scattered by a small force of whites, hastily gathered. Troops, marines, and militia were hurried to the scene, and the Negroes were hunted down. In all, 13 men, 18 women, and 24 children had been butchered. After hiding for several weeks, Turner was captured on August 30th and was tried and hanged, having made, meanwhile, a full confession. 19 of his associates were hanged and 12 were sent out of the state. The insurrection, which was attributed to the teachings of the abolitionists, led to the enactment of stricter slave codes. On this day in history, October 31st, 475, Romulus Augustulus is proclaimed Western Roman Emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the emperor. Romulus Augustulus, last Roman Emperor of the West, from October 31st, 475 AD to September 4th, 476, was elevated to the throne by his father, Orestes, master of the soldiery, Jordanes, who drove the Emperor Julius, Nepos, to Dalmatia in the summer of 475. Romulus, who was then probably about 14 years old, owed his first name to an uncle, Acanes of Patavio in Noricum. His nickname is probably owed to the barbarian soldiery, and by these two chances the last emperor successor of a Julius Caesar bore the names both of the first emperor and the first king. The reins of power were naturally held for him by his father, Orestes, nor is there any event of his reign worthy of record except the conclusion of peace with Gaiseric the Vandal. Shortly after his elevation to the throne, the barbarian mercenaries in the service of Rome presented to Romulus's father, Orestes, a demand that they should be allotted 1/3 of the lands of all Italy. With a last flicker of Roman courage and pride, Orestes refused. The mercenaries revolted under their leader and instigator, Odoacer, August 23rd, 476, and in a very short while Orestes was defeated and beheaded, and the Western Empire came to an end. The victorious Odoacer was touched by the beauty and helplessness of Romulus, and spared his life, ordering him to retire to the villa built by Lucullus 4 centuries before, near Naples. Here he died, at a date unknown to us.